So in the talk he gave last year on TED TV, the game design entrepreneur, Kevin Slavin, who's self-styled entrepreneur, raconteur, and provocateur. And I don't know if you're familiar with the TED TV style of talks, but they tend toward quite an exaggerated presentation of whatever problematic. So he described the development of a silent revolution of the economic, built, and social world driven by algorithms. This silent revolution was described to be driving a terraformation of the planet. Examples were given of the hollowing out of the center of Manhattan to create network speed advantages for HFT machines, blasting holes through the Allegheny Mountains, which is a range somewhere between New York and Chicago Stock Exchange, to run fiber optic cables to shoot high-speed trades, and also finally a vision of the kind of the future in which the poles of spatial development are predicted to follow the logic of computer networks and stock markets, not existing social and environmental needs. As a backdrop and intensifier of these outcomes, he described the takeover of financial trading and human judgment by the algorithmic logic that drives HFT and the chaotic effects that this gives rise to, such as the flash crash of 2010, is it? Yeah. Which basically created this kind of wild fluctuation in trading prices and kind of like browned out trading for, I think, very short time, but there was huge losses associated. So while on the one hand this could be described as scaremongering and exaggeration for maximum TED TV effect, it nevertheless provides an opportunity to assess the new qualities, effects and potentials of a kind of computational vitality, and also a kind of analysis that goes with it of this kind of vitalistic or vital force that the algorithm provides, which is in certain ways driving capitalist development. To play down the automating power of computer-driven algorithms by stressing their basis in social production and in human ingenuity, on the other hand, which is a response to this kind of exaggerated scaremongering of the algorithmic takeover of the planet, also can risk underplaying both their autopoietic characteristics, as well as the nevertheless powerful, productive and destructive forces they place in the hands of capitalism and resistance to it. So beyond this transversal contamination of all systems of value by the mathematical and abstract characteristics of algorithms, not least in the aesthetic field, and the impact they have on expressive and material affects and effects, which can all risk being sidelined. So nevertheless, there is a danger of overstating algorithmic autonomy, as in the case of Kevin Slavin. So then tonight, I think we need to sort of think about how to assess the real and the abstract power of these algorithms, neither by overstating their animism, if you like, their kind of autonomy from the social, but neither by underplaying that, so their autopoietic qualities. So I think that's kind of how we want to frame tonight, and also what we were thinking about in the issue. But at the same time, the issue was very much focused on HFT, and we want to widen that discussion beyond just financial trading. So, Anthony, I think
to compute, yeah. So I mean, the sort of first thing I guess wanted to pose is just a question of representation, especially, I guess, I see that sort of especially core to kind of Alberto's article, of this question of like what available representations of financial models are there, and how do they distort or, as you say, elide the social, but then also, in a sense, that question about what we can kind of know is central, so to Inigo and Bogdan's article, and in a sense kind of Johnny's practice kind of deals with maybe what's kind of in the black box of computing, or what's kind of hidden by that, what are the kind of mineral foundations or material foundations of these kind of things which seem to produce kind of very kind of light, speedy communication, etc. So maybe just if anybody wants to respond to that or deny the distortion that I'm making.
Well, yeah, I think okay. So, well, you kind of mentioned the idea of like what we can know in relation to what we're writing about, and so yeah, well, we're kind of basing a lot of the piece on was about this the relationship between information and noise, and so there's with efficient markets, the idea of efficient markets is that they're supposed to compute the equilibrium for a price in the most efficient way, right? So that kind of, if you were to try to discover the best price for an object, the market would do it much quicker and more efficiently than any kind of central control mechanism, which is one of the reasons why kind of the state communism kind of was was less efficient than the capitalist system in that time, right? But then I mean, there's also a kind of a dialectical kind of paradox almost with the idea of efficient markets, because as you move to efficiency, then there's a lesser chance of gaining profit from inefficiencies. Right, and so at that point, the closer that you get to efficiency, which you do get in high frequency trading, it is a move to efficiency in the sense that they're computing equilibriums in a much faster way. Then what happens is you get a higher degree of noise traders as a result of that. So noise traders are those traders who are looking at trends and profiting off the movement of those trends, rather than thinking about what the fundamental price should be. Okay. Now, then when you have a load of noise traders like this, it becomes less. The arbitrage possibilities for informed traders are so little that that they kind of drop out of the market to some extent. But then there's it comes to a thermodynamic kind of limit where kind of the tendency for noise trade to push to ride a kind of a bubble, effectively it becomes a bubble, and then that's going to collapse at some point.
So this idea of basically there's sort of factors which, if you consider price as a representation of products, some form of, or representation of a relation between product, then strangely there's a kind of converse production of noise of the opposite of a kind of clear signal.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, exactly. So effectively there's always noise in the system, and that's kind of the basis of information theory, right? But then the level of that noise kind of fluctuates according to kind of the makeup of the of who's trading and what they're trading on the basis of. So what models they're going on. So, and when the Black-Scholes-Merton model was dominant in it was all the traders were given the price information at the beginning of the day according to the BSM model, and so they all kind of knew that model and were trading on it. But this is where that seeming stability was what caused this kind of unstable crash, right? Because there was it generated a bunch of background noise, which gets to a threshold where everything breaks down again.
Yeah, I mean, what I like it's regarding what you said at the beginning, the metaphor that I'd like to use is actually one that you gave me, was with this what we do now with oil exploration and production, right? How you constantly have to look for once you've exhausted the, let's say, the more straightforward sources of oil, right, where it's cheaper to extract, you have to go into sands, right, in Canada or something, right, or have to go deeper, and it becomes more and more costly to actually get that resource. It's somehow the same with what's going on in this trading arena, because they make money from inefficiencies, right? But those inefficiencies are harder and harder to find, right? And that happens precisely because there's this arms race and this transition towards more efficient, let's say, models, mechanisms to compute right trading. And for us, in a way, I think that's why we think of whatever, either information or noise, because it's not very clear, whatever, as a resource, right? That gets harder to extract or harder to explore, to get at.
Yeah, because the niches have been taken.
But for me, basically, what's interesting, just in terms of on the economic theory side, is that the actual practice of what's going on is the most clear and, in the end, final critique of standard economics or whatever. If you, at least in some points, right? Because it totally invalidates this aspect of the fact that the economic agent, right, in a market, they're all the same, right? They're all equal in a sense, right?
In the ideal.
In the ideal model,
yeah.
right? Everyone has full access to information and can, if you want, process that information equally. Right? But what you see exactly here, and that's why I think that's one of the reasons why we use this ecosystem metaphor. That there are quite a high variety of species, in a sense, right? Which are quite heterogeneous, right? So this idea of the rational, or if you want, the equally rational subject, whatever actor that partakes in price discovery in the market, it's over. It's clearly, what you see today, that there are these huge asymmetries in the market. Right? And the only way that slower players can survive is by getting bigger, if you want, or by scale, right? Scaling up. Because usually all these HFTs, it's interesting because you have high frequency trading also in the big banks, but the most successful ones are really small, kind of boutique, small players, right? And that's actually one problem, is that the banks are allowed to do it and they shouldn't be, right? Because if you want to take an ecosystem perspective, a global bank now is like, if you think of an ecosystem, it's an animal that can fly, it can climb trees, it can swim, it can go underwater, it eats everything. So it's like an animal that it's adaptable to every environment, and and that's the problem, right? That's why it should be split up.
So that's the limit of the ecological metaphor, or that's...
Well, for me, sure.
Right.
Goldman Sachs is that kind of animal, right? Or whatever, a global kind of integrated bank is that kind of animal that simply can, exploit everything that's out there somehow, right? And in an ecosystem, in a real ecosystem, such an animal would just be totally destructive. Because there's no selective pressures on it, in a sense. Fees can just adapt to everything. But yeah, that's...
But so in what way is it useful to import ecological
No,
models into economics?
I don't think it's a metaphor. For me, for me, it's not a metaphor. It's about applying. It's about applying a range of concepts from ecological science to economics, and they work in exactly the same way. They describe different things. So economic processes can be understood ecologically. They are different from biological ecologies. Nevertheless, they can be understood ecologically under ecological scientific conditions. So that it's not a metaphorical use of the term, and
It's functional.
It's and the fact that there's say investment banks are there's no analog in biological terms doesn't mean that that it's not a working model anymore. Right? It's just
So to kind of pick up on the question of models, Alberto, you kind of like retrieved this phrase, which was from Donald Mackenzie, the engine, not a camera, which I believe is actually he got it from Milton Friedman, in fact, from 1953, I think. And I was kind of you kind of posed the question of we have fairly superficial, almost aesthetic kind of or art. Kind of representations of markets, which you say are kind of insufficient, and on the other hand, you also discuss an essay by Susan Buck-Morse about this kind of history of financial representations and how kind of they usually, are kind of quite ideal or kind of idealizing. So it's kind of interested, I guess, to ask you the question of whether you see kind of representation as possible, or what kind of form of description do you see as like kind of necessary to apply to this system?
I thought what was very curious about the that video that Josie referred to is that it starts from this, in many ways, totally spurious but partially charming photo project, which is in fact, I think, the image which is then in the issue, this Michael Najjar project, which one of the commentators in the catalogue, again, rather cutely refers to as subprime sublime, but he basically does these, it's quite curious because he doesn't actually take stock footage, he goes to mountains of Patagonia and so on, and then digitally jigs the photos to match the peaks and troughs of a particular day's trading and so on. And throughout that Kevin Slavin talk, he has this real obsession, which I think is curious, with the representations of algorithmic trading, the sort of geometric patterns that you get when traders on a screen see the activity of a particular algorithm for a particular period of time in a particular market, and so on and so forth. And then, he goes on about how, they look like certain shapes. So one of them is called a knife, the other, et cetera, et cetera. And it's kind of curious because there's possibly nothing, no form of financial transaction that is less prone to, to a familiar and, commonsensical notion of figuration or representation than high-frequency trading, for no other reason than of the time. So, once you have transactions and, so to speak, decisions, which are decisions only by a very distant analogy that take place at a, millisecond, nanosecond, etc. level, then you're not. You're in a domain that's so far below what is the threshold of human perception. So that's a kind of starting point. Now, you could take that into, as many people do, a sort of, anti-humanist celebration, like we enjoy our own obsolescence and the fact that, machines are capable of deciding at speeds and with capacities that are completely impossible for a human body or a corporation or whatever. But I think what I was trying to get at in my own piece is actually once you look into the implementation of high-frequency trading, and obviously I'm doing this partly because the only reason I know anything about it is because I was asked to write a piece, so this is a complete interpolation. But once you start looking into it, what's really curious is the regulatory, physical, institutional processes that have to take place in order to make this seemingly, smooth cybernetic utopia or dystopia to occur. one of them, which is the one that I try to focus on a little bit more because I think it's interesting in terms of that whole question of representation, is the materiality of it. High frequency trading needs lots of servers, it needs coolers, it needs enormous data centers, which have to be built in certain parts of New Jersey because of the cost of real estate and so on and so forth. And so you get, that's what I was trying to, I don't know if it works, but when I use this expression, sort of, rather heterodox use of a Marxian expression about the kind of organic composition of finance, I think it does get at something about high-frequency trading, which is that the level of investment and the cost of the material, the material component, the undersea fiber optic cables, the digging through the mountains, the enormous data centers in New Jersey, all of this, in order to beat your competitor by 7 milliseconds or whatever. So that, I think, is that dimension is very interesting. The other dimension that's very interesting is a kind of is a dimension of the regulation and the property issues, because in a sense the trading takes place in private. These are private markets. They're not public markets. They're many of them are. You have the fiber optic cables are privately owned. And there's all sorts of monopolies and selections that take place in that way. So and a lot of conflicts and struggles that take place in terms of who gets access to the
Raw
servers,
data.
who gets access. One thing I found really fascinating, and this is a kind of vaguely sort of technological, vaguely sort of Bruno Latour social science kind of thing, but the fact that for regulatory reasons, because the speeds are so intensely significant, that they had to, if you have in a data centers, the cables themselves had to be lengthened and shortened so that everybody who'd paid for this service got the same amount of time. Because actually, if the cables, one cable was longer and the other cable was shorter, so you had to materially artificially create a condition that made the regulatory situation possible. And that's where the representation is politically interesting, because the opacity has to do not just with the fact that it's below the threshold of perception and experience, but it's below the threshold of political regulation in a very significant sense. There is no way, short of saying you can't do this, that whatever kind-hearted, bleeding heart democratic liberal congressman who wants to regulate high-frequency trading can regulate algorithms. It's like so, partly because the algorithms themselves are changing and many of them are not exactly known by the very people who designed them. They evolve and change and so on and so forth. So the possibility of regulating those processes. So there's a kind of, I think that level of representation is perhaps more interesting than can you make good art about high-frequency trading. I think there's a kind of intrinsic opacity, and the opacity is a political issue. It's a political and economic issue, because it's saying, well, some people don't have access to particular trades. And the other thing which is curious about the opacity, and this is where people are trying to regulate, is that actually the vast majority, of course, of high-frequency trades are cancelled. That's the whole point. It's like it's a sort of
noise,
automated noise and bluff and so on. So like over 90% of trades are sent out and to, in a sense, to fake the competitors, and then they're cancelled. And one of the few attempts at regulation that might be feasible is actually to tax the fakes, so to speak.
Or to,
Tobin tax, you mean?
No, not the Tobin tax. Actually, just
the fakes,
just a tax cancellation. Because
there is
Yeah.
There is
Pseudo.
Bid
European
price
Parliament.
ask, is that what it's called, the bid price ask? Yeah.
No, it's basically it's like you said. There's this order to trade ratio. So if you make 100 orders, half of them have to trade, actually execute. There are these. I think the European Parliament, they have a lot of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, there's another element which I don't think really many the pieces dealt with, which I think is quite interesting, is that actually the temptation would be to say, the temptation would be to think, okay, well, this is the cutting edge of automated finance. It's impersonal, to some extent impersonal, or seemingly uncontrollable, chaotic, or whatever. Therefore, it should be thought of as in a sense, the kind of culprit of financialized instability or separation from the real economy and that kind of discourse. And that's not, it's interesting that it doesn't quite work because of course high frequency trading doesn't have anything to do directly with the ongoing financial crisis. You could say it's an effect of the fact that there's an intense compulsion for people to look for profit making and valorization and increasingly in these kind of like penny trades because they're in this arbitrage over absolute because it's really a volume over absolutely minuscule trades that actually in themselves are not the flash crash is a very different kind of crash and it's not really organic to the development to the situation of the economy as a whole. So
I was just talking actually recently with someone at the German stock exchange about the flash crash. And an interesting point was that, and you get this kind of German, conservatism, this kind of attitude, because the flash crash happened in the States, in the American market, right? In America, he was basically saying it could never happen in Germany or in Europe, because we have well-calibrated circuit breakers. Which means that when
the red button gets pressed
when a stock starts to go down too fast, we just suspend, right? And he said, well, because the American markets are less regulated, they didn't really have that provision, right? But what's interesting is that what he's saying basically is that markets are not efficient, because if markets were efficient, you don't need to pause trading, right? Because in the end, it should be efficient. But what shows you exactly, the actual materiality of how it works now, especially in Europe, is that you have very strict circuit breakers that monitor behavior all the time now. And it's precisely because
How are these algorithms generated, or how are they beta tested, or they be launched straight on the market? That's what how do you access them? What classes of algorithms are we talking about? How are they renewed and how are they tested?
I don't know. I mean, personally, the only people that I talked to in my research, my interviews, were saying that you never have laboratory, conditions. So there is testing, because you test these algorithms on historic fluctuations and volatility.
So models of past market behavior.
Yeah, exactly. So you just run past history through them, and but basically there's no way to actually test them until you actually plug them in.
Plus, also, exactly. It's exactly how this kind of relates to kind of the mathematical kind of logic, and so the Gödel's incompleteness and Turing's undecidability and so on. It's because algorithms are they work on classical logic effectively. They're formalistic, and Gödel kind of he showed that there can't be any kind of foundation to that would describe the totality of that. So there is no ground to this. So you can't kind of check whether an algorithm is going to work perfectly apart from by using it, right? In the same way as you can't check a software program is going to work for all its instances apart from by using all of its instances. I mean, you can bug check to some degree, but there's an element of just because it can't be formalized as a totality. So and this is the problem with algorithms. They're just that they don't have any ignorance preservation. Basically, that they cannot if they can either do it or not do it, but they can't kind of go I'm ignorant, I'm not sure kind of thing.
Well, I think, this point about the sort of inability to create a totalistic representation in the case of algorithms bears a really profound resemblance to also a kind of political condition that we've entered into after 68, roughly speaking, in which the kind of models of history based around negative dialectics, the teleology of history collapses, and with that, the sort of determining role of, for example, the contradiction that builds the pressure, which creates the negation, and then the negation is negated, and then we have, this kind of synthesis. And we've definitely moved into a position in which, the commodity form no longer seems to offer, for example, an explanation of the social form in as direct a way as had been conceived of. And so, if you think about the sort of post-structuralist models of or analysis of power and struggle, they seem to actually have many resemblances to the kinds of dynamics that we're talking about within algorithms, or within algorithmically driven trading, and these, for example, I think can be linked to also vitalist models. So the idea of a non-totalizable set of forces that have to meet, dominate, alter, replicate each other, have these kind of vitalist dynamics. So I'm really interested to think about this kind of how you see the relationship maybe between models of the social field, and not that it's kind of in any way distinct, but then also these kind of both cybernetic and algorithmic kinds of behaviors that we're describing. And it seems almost as though you have something within the actual mode of the development of capitalist forces of production that also seem to be in some way of a piece with our ability to kind of think the political and think the social. And I don't know if you've got sort of, if you can say anything about, whether you do see these as actually informing each other, or
sorry, what does inform each other?
The non-totalizable kind of vitalistic or animistic idea of the forces of production themselves, which have become algorithmic and cybernetic, and ideas about the social field, about the loss of a kind of telos of history, of a model of praxis of struggle, so that we're kind of in the soup at both, you might say at both ends, both sort of productive soup and a social, a sort of political soup. That maybe soup is overplaying it. I don't think that's really actually right. Maybe a soup with lots of big chunky bits. But
Okay.
A stew.
Social
Thank
stew.
you.
Ecology.
But
And
but the curious thing about talking of this in terms of whatever broadly post-structuralist ideas of non-totalizable systems is that in one sense that's the not just intrinsic but I think kind of performative ontology of neoliberalism. Hayek in a number of texts, Law, Legislation, Liberty, writes about this distinction. There's taxis and there's cosmos. So taxis is imposed order, this is a bad thing that commie states do. And then there's cosmos, which is spontaneous, multiplicitous order that comes about from the activities of multiple non-totalizable either individualistic market entities, or in a more sort of cybernetically or friendly version, kind of swarms of actors or whatever. So I think there's a kind of spontaneous ideology to the idea of algorithmic trading, which is this notion, that and this is where I think this is nice work by these two quite heterodox and very interesting Marxian economists, I think from Australia, Dick Bryan and Michael Rafferty, who write about the transformation in this idea of fundamental value. And one of the things that's interesting is that actually the kind of more performative market-making price discovery mechanisms that relate to algorithmic trading are quite different than neoclassical ideas that there is, in fact, a kind of fundamental value, because they're ultimately very relativistic. Like the values are completely relative to the perspectival conflicts between different market actors, and then they stabilize around a particular value. But that's a contestable agonistic value. It's not. The market's not efficient in the sense of finding the actual value of a product, partly because the temporal dimensions that are involved in options and derivatives and so on are such that you can't, sort of define that. Now, on the other hand, you could say, well, what makes, what drives money, what drives capital towards things like high-frequency trading? Well, it's the fact that there's not that much return on capital in other sectors. So in one sense, actually, fairly, in a negative sense, I think fairly traditional, so to speak, political economic analyses don't necessarily explain to you how high-frequency trading operates, or its spatial dynamics, its mathematical dynamics, and so on. But they might explain why there's a tendency to seek yield, seek profits in these points of arbitrage, because the capital elsewhere is not particularly fructiferous in various ways. So I think and I think there could be. I mean, I'm wary of making grandly catastrophic gestures, but there could be an argument linking this to to particular limits, fairly classically understandable, of capital accumulation in other in other sectors of the economy. Why the volume of trade in HFT is so great. But that's so. I think the danger would be to take that as model and then to say, well, just like there's algorithmic trading, there's algorithmic politics or whatever. Like, I don't think that would. Because I think the reason why it has the significance that it, it's, you kind of have to think to yourself, like, what would compel people to invest $300 million to dig a hole through, mountains between, just so it could be a straight line, and it could be 7 milliseconds instead of 13 milliseconds. I mean, like, that seems maybe not a direct symptom of the crisis of capital, but a fairly indirect one. Like, and that's why I think the fantasies are really curious. It's like, okay, so valorization is becoming so difficult that you're contemplating building enormous platforms in the middle of the fucking Pacific Ocean so that you could beat by 1 millisecond an arbitrage trade on, like, pork derivatives or whatever. Like, that seems slightly, a sign that something may be a little. Something maybe, but those are, if you read a lot of the more utopian levels of that literature, like, there is this idea that the Earth will become this kind of financial sensorium that is organized entirely to make the most efficient trades possible.
But it's somehow similar. Sorry, to our kind of in order to get that barrel of oil from the sands of Canada. Right. I mean, all the energy and effort.
Yeah, you have to spend like 25
it's only
barrels
viable
of oil
because there's war in the Middle East, right? And the price is really high. Right? And that's the only thing that makes it viable, because actually the energy that you put into it and the human effort is just crazy.
Yeah, and I mean,
It's
well,
not,
just,
you know,
you
doesn't
know,
make
and with this kind of low latency trading kind of benefits that have kind of hit their peak, right? Supposedly, so you know, even though they're doing these, you know, spending $3 million to go through the Allegheny Mountains or whatever, you know, that's the kind of about the limit. You know, what are you going to do next? You know, the amount that you would have to spend to beat that wouldn't get you as much profit as you had spent. So it's more, well,
So it's kind of like
the area of development now is more in kind of quants and models and so on, rather than high,
And even
Better algorithms rather than
but
precise
even,
location.
even more than that, I mean, the important thing now, the political, if you want, point which the industry is doing is to defend some bastions of profitability, right? So, because mostly electronic trading has developed in stocks, mostly. And what they're trying to do is to restrict now if you want, the intrusion of electronic and algorithmic trading into some areas like the bond market or other, which are very opaque, right? But which produce high yields, right? As soon as you standardize or, you know, introduce transparency and allow other people to come in, like these, you know, high frequency traders, whatever, or anyone who can do some sort of technological investment and get in the market, right? As long as it's a kind of a secluded space, which it is in a lot of derivatives, complex derivatives, right? There's this basic point now that and it's an argument for human decision making, for the, you know, or almost the privilege of the human to be there, right? Because exactly like Inigo was saying, at this point, at the level of so in every market in which you have electronic trading now, the yields are getting smaller and smaller because there's too much competition now. Everyone who can invest some money,
Tendency of the
right?
problem.
And now the whole and now the whole point is to defend some markets, some instruments, right? You know,
But it's interesting that defense is a it's a strictly political
it's a
defense. Like
huge
you have to
lobbying,
make regulatory decisions that, you know, in that sense. So that's where there's a kind of interesting contradiction in the whole, because the spontaneous ideology of this kind of Hayekian catallaxis, like spontaneous order, etc. But in order to make this possible, you have to make really invasive political decisions, and contrary to those versions of this that pitch algorithms as a kind of something that evades political or state control. In a sense it does, because it evades the kind of social regulation and so on, but it's totally dependent on the state as, you know, the state as making liquidity possible in various ways, which is what's at stake. You know, now,
But you see, this is the kind of tension that I was trying to bring out in my rambling introduction, is that there seems to be a kind of tendency in the analysis of, I guess, this kind of algorithmic animism, if I can call it that, to either say, no, it's actually, these things are all based in a kind of determinable human substrate or social or political substrate, and can be, you know, linked back to those things, or to kind of like do the Kevin Slavin of, like, you know, the dystopian sci-fi of it's exactly, we've spawned this kind of this robot phase transition that is just going to chew us up and spit us out, and it seems as though the analysis wavers between these poles.
But those two things surely aren't incompatible, are they?
Right. That's the question.
Totally, yeah. And I think there's a constant kind of movement. You know, there's a constant pressure by both sides, which is causing, you know, it's a dialectical kind of thing. It's, you know, it's.
But it's also that, you know, it does seem to be that for reasons that are by no means socially or economically mysterious, certain processes, you know, certain practices have been generated which are actually have, so to speak, a logic of their own. I mean, you know, there's not into kind of theories of alienation or whatever,
Maybe
but you know but it is
Johnny,
you know,
sorry to interrupt you, but
no,
I'm
no,
just
no,
thinking,
no.
Johnny, maybe you've got
No, just,
something to say on that.
I mean, about the asymmetry of driving £300 million hole through a tunnel. Of course, there's a lot of collateral around that of people, technology, bodies, materialities that are involved in that are not particularly. They're kind of enforcing an order over flesh, over lived experience for those people involved in it, as they are when you run algorithms on any computer. There's a lived experience that's been oppressed or repressed or dispossessed in producing this thing that you're running it on. There's always a materiality at the base of everything that you're talking about. At the moment, HFTs, they have collateral all the time. That's, I guess, what you're on about. And for my own concerns is about digging down into the layers below the circuit board. So I think Inigo mentioned thermodynamics in the article. We talk about a lot about thermodynamics, and of course Feynman and people like this when they talked about computation, and Turing as well. Turing wasn't interested in the materiality of the implementation or the contingency of what you implemented something on. Feynman tried to address this in terms of thermodynamics and linking it with Shannon and communication and noise and the rest of it. But nonetheless, there's an inherent instability in those materials that run these algorithms. They themselves are stochastic. They don't. When you put a current through them, they fluctuate all the time. There's no regularity in their behaviours. So I don't know what.
But
the whole
that's
thing's
a really-
based on this fundamental incoherency or irregularity.
Exactly, and I think and there's
Entropy.
there'll always be this kind of friction between mathematics and the material physical world that the system that it's modelling. So the model and the system, and especially in this case, in finance, what you have is just this kind of huge diversity of models that are competing, and that's the self-referential quality of the market, which we were talking about earlier. Is that the way that it's no longer a concern what the real price of a thing is what the other models think the price are, and so what you're modelling is all of the other models, and so there's this but then all of those competing models relate to a real thing, the material kind of basis of the commodity and the supply routes and so on. And there's a constant friction with that, and the friction generally kind of hits those people who suffered from the subprime mortgage crisis, for example. It hits the poor, and not those people in Wall Street who've cashed in their bonuses already.
Or the protected bond market.
But I think one of the reasons why it has that kind of sort of sick fascination for people in a sense is because when you get these accounts like the Allegheny Mountains, the data centers in New Jersey, etc., you in a sense get the most extreme schematic version of the transformation of that lived experience of flesh and matter and territory, etc., for the sake of the immediate, if ephemeral, demands of particular abstractions, of particular models, of particular, mathematical requirements. So the idea that there's something, even though it's probably wrong, there's something less disturbing about the idea that people are being displaced and dispossessed in order to build dam, to generate electricity for factories or whatever, than there is of the idea that people are being displaced to build a giant data centers full of servers so that, somebody can have 13 milliseconds instead of 14 milliseconds difference in the speed to the stock market. So I think part of in the Slavin thing, if you think of the kind of fantasy underlying it, and the the attraction to it is this idea. What if the world what if our material bodily life? It's a kind of dystopia of cybernetic dystopia. It's like, what if everything were being shaped to create the least possible friction for the operation of these abstractions. And that I think that's part of why it has some of the, it seems to me part of the reason why it has some of the attraction that it has, both horror, fascination in the sense of both horror and attraction depending on where your politics stand.
Yeah, I mean that image of the world, the material world being subordinate to the abstract power of the algorithm is of course also what is going on, has been going on for several hundred years with the real abstraction of capital, as we know.
Like building ports or whatever, but this just seems too immediate, like from the abstraction to the physical reality with no mediation rather than...
Yes. But I wanted to just focus a little bit on aesthetics within this, and it links in some sense to what Anthony was saying earlier about the representability or non-representability of the kind of folding of mathematical, abstract and cybernetic systems into material and social and political ones, and how the sort of idea of a return to a return to the underlying reality of the kind of material is or is not possible anymore, and then from that the idea so the sort of the dream of Marx that we can kind of shatter the phantasmagoria of the commodity form and return to a direct relationship to objects based on use, or to the material world based on use, that may really just seem to have receded in ways that are also hopeful, right? So that this sort of sense of a kind of like a loss of that kind of spectral, phantasmagoric quality of that resides in the commodity, and that is then also kind of intensified in this animism, as I keep calling it, of the algorithmic. That's like, is that even something that people want to get rid of any longer? Like some sort of direct, unmediated relation to the material real. And I just wanted to sort of pick up on some things that Guattari writes about in his Chaosmosis, where he talks about the new aesthetic paradigm, and part of what he says in his discussion of a kind of transition into a processual aesthetics, basically, that leaves behind it the Enlightenment moment of aesthetics, which is related to these transcendental enunciators, as he calls them. So, the idea of being, of God, of capital, all of these kinds of transcendental systems that are still with us in some way, but also kind of like not maintaining this kind of static relation to the individual, right? I mean, for him, that's the kind of couplet, I suppose, is individuation, and then this kind of this system of bifurcation. Anyway, sorry, just to move on over that quickly. So the new aesthetic paradigm for him brings with it, and it's one based fundamentally in the idea of process and processuality. And I'll just read you a little quote. He says, "The decisive threshold constituting this new aesthetic paradigm lies in the aptitude of these processes of creation to auto-affirm themselves as existential nuclei, autopoietic machines." And then a little bit further on he says, we need to shed our mechanistic vision of the machine and embrace all its aspects, biological, informatic, social, theoretical, aesthetic. And then he claims that by thinking of the machine as a vitally creative force, that this has ethico-political implications. Creation entails responsibility for what is created. So I was just wondering, particularly Johnny, if what you think about the idea that when you bring a processual entity into the world. Like, you know, if it's, I don't know, just like a piece of code, or if it's a kind of social, technological assemblage which unfolds in time, whether you have a kind of idea about the ethical implications of that, whether you would, you know, as a practitioner, whether you would take that on. Because I think it's a very interesting, you know, way to think about the difference between these kind of capitalistic, automations, forms of automated process, and a more aesthetic form of processuality. So that was a real godfall.
I don't know. I think the things I, with others, always collaborate around executing is not with any teleology particularly in mind. So it's not to promote some kind of social, processual kind of politics or ethics. I think they're implicit in some of the outputs, in what we produce, or what we invite other people to work with us to produce. So the kind of projects I do are usually with 15 to 20 people who come from open calls, and usually are based around computational materiality. That's the kind of thing kind of eviscerate or excavate at the moment in the projects I'm involved with. Ryan, who hosts the space, and a couple of other people. So in terms of any ramifications or outputs that feed up or feed across or throughput to other dimensions, I'm going to play a kind of neutral position on that. What was the question?
Well, just the ethics of bringing, of actually, in a sense, of creating something that is, in some sense, vital, or some sense, you know, has a life beyond the object, the kind of classically understood aesthetic object, which has a sort of, you know, much more determinable future, arguably, right, as a kind of knowable entity that will remain relatively unchanged, you know, for you know, across, I don't know, centuries if need be. So that creating these more social, technical forces that have a kind of less predictable behaviour and outcome, how you think about, well, the kind of challenge of Guattari in a way to think about these ethico-politically, because it's like bringing something into the world as almost like a living form for him.
Yeah. I don't know, because I have more of a kind of slightly more negative, dystopic. I think some of the projects have an element of refusal, like a Tronti-esque refusal running through them, or that's some intent from my own point of view. But as I say, the throughput of the projects is not a particular concern of mine for those who are taking part in it. So to heighten it into some ethico-political sort of substrate, or the beginnings of a new substrate or something, or inclination towards that kind of thing, that's not something I is conscious in it. That's not the answer you're looking for.
No,
but it is. Kind of,
I just wanted to know.
But it's kind of about, it's really about demystifying computation as because for so long from Turing onwards, it's the UTM and all the rest of it has been, it's a universal Turing machine, and then the Oracle machine, and latterly we've moved into biocomputation and things like this, which is a completely different category of fish. Computer fish, if you like. But there is still the relation to our access to what those things do for us, and in the same point doing it for themselves. So biocomputation works on the premise that these things do these things. How do we access it to do things at the same time for us? So there's this relationship that I'm kind of interested in excavating a bit.
I think that might have been a sign, actually. I think this conversation has gone on for quite a long time between us, but it would be good now to have some questions, if there are any. Before we can't hear each other any longer.
I was curious if anyone had any opinion on what's happening with Bitcoin. It's been having some interesting movements.
Yeah. There's been a lot of talk about it recently on net time and so on, but yeah, I just haven't had time to have a look at it, so I can't comment.
On that time.
Do you?
I mean, there's quite a good article on Mute from a few months ago on about Bitcoin by the is it? I guess it's the Wine and Cheese Society of Greater London who wrote that, and is very much doesn't cover this kind of question of price fluctuation, except saying that Bitcoin is de facto money, is it's more or less operates exactly the same as any other currency, but since it doesn't have a state controlling it, you can expect fluctuation. Plus, it's new, so. But I mean, I think the article is quite interesting and going quite a lot deeper behind maybe the more kind of ethical sort of values that attach themselves to Bitcoin, and really sort of kind of criticizing that and really questioning why, alternative. What is alternative about alternative currency if it simply reproduces money in all its kind of aspects, apart from it.
Yeah, and plus also kind of functions in this kind of black market space for capital. Right?
Yeah.
Well, a lot of the discussion that I've read, a few of the last mails on NetTime is all about how this is truly libertarian because there's no tax paid on financial transactions. So this has been something that they've been getting up in arms about. But I know that's not actually what you're referring to. Maybe you've got something to say, because
nothing that intelligent. No,
there's been loads of derivative.
More intelligent input to it.
There's been a lot of derivative trading around
yeah,
it. Is that
gained drastically since Cyprus had their problems and it's just been skyrocketing. But I think it kind of crashed a bit very recently.
There was a little crash, yeah.
Wasn't there some problem over its exchangeability? I mean, we've been talking very much about, I suppose, currency operating within a certain system or algorithmic or electronic space, but something that seemed to be troubling commentators was its actual usability and exchangeability in the real world.
Bitcoin.
Yeah. Well, this is it's the idea of the double payment, or is the idea of a double payment. I think it's exchangeable. You can exchange it with any major currency. So, in fact, effectively, you can sell drugs, get Bitcoin, buy dollars. So. And buy anything you want with the dollars, so that makes it.
But you
more
can't blame Bitcoin for that.
No, but I think
Where
there's a will, there's a way.
It can be exchanged for other currencies, but it cannot be exchanged directly for goods or services.
I don't think there's anything per
But
se.
that's like but that's what you have in America. You have a lot of libertarian dreams of creating your own currency. Or Inigo creates tomorrow his Inigo whatever, which is a piece of paper, right?
Yeah.
And he comes to you and
The other variant of this is that in Utah they actually passed a law whereby you can actually buy anything in Utah in gold.
Okay. Yeah.
You just go and they have to weigh it. It's brilliant. It's this completely deranged form of, the obsession is like the state is evil because the state prints money, and then there's a conspiracy of fiat money, etc. So you can just bring your nuggets. Your nuggets.
Which is what makes me, who is it? Max Kaiser is kind of trying to set up a Bitcoin exchange place in UK, and he's one of these gold enthusiasts, and that's what makes me suspicious.
Like Glenn Beck, it's a dubious scene.
No, but even in going back to the States, and there's this again, when you have this critique of the Federal Reserve System, right, and this kind. But if you look before that, in the free banking period in the 19th century, it was full of fraud and panics, and people were just losing money because there was 8,000 banks popping up, overnight, printing money as it were, their own money, right? So there's always this, but it was great. It was very free and whatever.
Because where the amount of, as it were, debt or credit exceeds the amount of goods that are in the economy. I mean, is it similar to
it always
subprime, something that causes, like, say, a subprime mortgage crisis or no?
Yeah, but I think from an economic point of view, it's a question of degree, right? It's the degree of leverage that's in the system, right?
And the degree, and the confidence in the market. So
that's why we should have oxidizable money. Like it destroys.
Oh yeah, Schwundgeld. There's like a disappearing money idea. Yeah.
But yeah,
I'd be curious if anybody here discussing this is other fields than economics that they're interested in, the way the algorithm works, or fields other than economics that might show something about the algorithm that might be worth discussing.
I'm doing, my research is on noise in general, so I'm doing a lot of stuff on algorithms in music, and also Johnny works in it.
Yeah, that works on it.
You'll see.
Yeah, sort of.
Yeah, I mean that's why, you know, in a way there's there's a specificity to these different kind of material kind of organisations, right? And you know, so the algorithms, the way algorithms affected music culture was very different from the way algorithms affected financial kind of cultures, and you know, totally incommensurable in some ways, right?
Can I make a point about ecosystems, or ask a question really?
Yeah.
So what's driving economic theory at the moment is nicking ideas from physics, essentially. So the flash crash can be explained, modelled quite well, using a theory of the natural flooding of the Nile.
Yeah.
So physicists are going across into economics, and economics is mining out physics quite efficiently. Physicists are really good at dealing with huge volumes of data. So would you say, I mean, unpacking Josie's stew question a bit, I mean, would you say in scientific terms that algorithmic trading might be some kind of paradigm shift that has some sort of, you know, shifting effect on social discourses? I mean, is it a step change? I mean, the problem really is that we've always had algorithms of some sort or another in finance. So, you know, if you're arguing that it's a step change, it might be.
Yeah, no, it's just a matter of degree. It's just a huge upturn in the use of them. You know, the huge number of different, you know, the diversity of algorithms and the huge speed at which they're working. That's the massive change.
It's also a function of the algorithms within the system, isn't it?
Yeah.
Are you talking, for example, say an algorithm from say 200 years ago would be in a sense a protocol of behaviour, a certain pattern of doing things?
We've always had mathematical models. Some of them relate to speculation. Some of them, you know, are constraints in the system.
But they themselves didn't enact themselves, if you like.
Well, that's the computation part.
Well, that's why I'm saying
in some ways it has a different
step. Is this a really big?
But that,
well, a good way.
Part of that.
Well,
sorry.
But I was just going to say, I think it's probably from your article, Alberto, but one of you, I can't remember which one, writes about the length of time that stocks were owned.
Mm-hmm.
Is this
yeah.
you?
Yeah.
Well, it's me quoting somebody else.
Well, I think you're all quoting the same stats, but roughly it's sort of like 100 years ago, it was about 4 years, the turnover. And, you know, from 2011, it's like, what, like 0.4 seconds
gone down.
or something.
This is the...
so
the average.
1945 is 4 years, 2000 is 8 months, 2008 is 2 months, and 2011 is 22 seconds. So that's the amount of holding.
It's a quantitative change, clearly, that's quite dramatic. But for example, in terms of boring a hole through the Allegheny Mountains, again, finance has borrowing in its modelling quite heavily from physics. If you look at the Hadron Collider, the amount of capital that goes into big science, you know, a bit of fibre optic cable through amount, $300 million is nothing, absolutely nothing.
Probably less than a banker's bonus in a year.
I mean, one of the curious things that you mentioned about the relationship between these mathematical forms and the social forms is that one of the things that, I mean, this is the Brian and Rafferty's Capitalism with Derivatives book does very interestingly, is about this question about the ways in which derivatives and you know, algorithmic trading also engage in various practices of commensurability. So their kind of argument is, broadly speaking, that you know, once you unfix units, universalizable units of or standards of value, you know, gold standard, etc., etc., the way that value is anchored in the contemporary system, it's anchored not externally vis-a-vis some standard, but it's anchored vis-a-vis all of these immanent and internal but totally commensurable mechanisms. So the thing that's curious about, you know, both derivatives and algorithmic trading is the kind of you know, the fact that they're indifferent, you know, that they're extremely indifferent to the material or empirical or historical content of that which they're you know, the algorithm is entirely doesn't care what it's operating with, and in fact, the people who are the company, it's not even a decision of, you know, like there's algorithms that you know, scan news about particular stocks and so on and so forth, but there isn't a sense of identifying a particular area of the market as an area that you want to invest in. It's just, you know, it's kind of pure commensuration. So the part of the curious thing about discussing it in terms of social form and social forces is the extent of its indifference to content, like indifference to what it's commensurating over. And part of the argument about liquidity, and Brian and Rafferty make this quite well, part of the argument about the primacy of liquidity is about making it increasingly possible to immediately, with no costs, and the important thing about the algorithmic trading is to lower immensely the costs of shifting of shifting value across transactions. Yeah, the transaction costs drop immensely, and so therefore you lower the cost of shifting capital
that's
across
why
seemingly incommensurable.
No, but there's
domains,
this great,
so.
just referring to what you were saying, there's this great book by Iles,
yeah.
It's called The Blank Swan.
The Blank Swan. It's a great title.
And no, but what's great about, I mean, for me is that he says, you know, this guy was an options trader in Paris and then in London.
Yeah.
And his first day.
Still an options trader?
No. I mean, he's got his own company.
Okay.
Actually, he has a software company that prices for options. But his first day at work on the pits in Paris was the 1987 crash. So he came there, and he tells this story in the book. He comes there, first day at work, and everything goes down. People are, you know, depressed. You know, that's the end of the world. And he just says, well, you know, he thought that's the normal way the market works. He said, okay. You know. Came the next day, and you know, it was even worse because it was, you know, going down for weeks. But what I like in his book, he says this, look, the way I was successful there was that I was blank. So when I would go to work, I would never read the news, I wouldn't talk to anyone, and we would just meet. It was an imminent meeting between a few traders, and we just set up the price through our interaction. And he said, the more you came with a biased or, you know, some sort of this, you know, kind of opinion.
Down,
yeah, exactly.
War,
you couldn't really. He said, long term, you couldn't make money. You could only make money if you were this kind of contingent, and he uses a lot of mayas.
Idiot savant.
Yeah, exactly.
But then he's arguing that the trader kind of writes the future by making you make the market by writing the future. Effectively by saying I will pay this at this price in the future at some point. Then you've performatively produced this kind of effect, and that's what market making is.
And he uses this kind of not metaphor maybe, but of writing, right? It's kind of an whatever.
But that's curious because then it seems that the limit then is just the purely external limit. It's like liquidity stops, and then no one can engage in these things, and it's not. It seems less nuanced in the sense that it's imminent until it's no longer imminent. It's imminent until you have the capacity to continue.
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, but I mean, in my personal view, is that you have, and I mean, it comes from talking to a lot of people in the city, right? They have this very clear view that they are simply a transmission mechanism. So when liquidity comes in from society, whatever, from pension funds, insurance companies, from governments, from taxpayers, whatever, they transmit it. They just transmit it further. When there's a crash or there's a problem, they transmit it further, So they have this very, like you're saying, this kind of contentless aspect to it, right? We don't really care what we're transmitting or exchanging.
The traders without qualities.
And it's the same thing, right? I mean, the big problem with the financial transaction tax, as we will see, and that's what people have been telling me, is that look, we will simply transmit it further.
Yeah.
So if you tax our transaction, well, you have to think about who are our actual clients. And they're the pension funds, and the sovereign wealth funds, and insurance companies, and BMW. So your cars will be more expensive. Your pension premium or your insurance premium will be more expensive. That's how they talk. They say we have to transmit it.
It's a bit like
because there's no content to it, like you said. We're just transmitting. We're just exchanging. And what's
the question?
Just wondering how this sort of affects the commensuration and difference, and so on, relates to kind of abstract labour. Just thinking the kind of focus of abstraction is on the sort of fetishization of finance as the site of pure abstraction, or some kind of asymptotic drift towards pure abstraction. Whereas I'm just thinking in lots of the things you're describing about affectless, contentless, I transmit things, sounds like the general experience of abstract labour in capital. So I just wondered, which also generates, I think, other fantasies of vitality and things that kind of answer that. But I just wondered, is there a way to, rather than connecting some kind of real use, etc., materiality, I think connecting abstractions to abstractions, connecting the abstraction of labour to the abstraction of HFT or this kind of affective indifference. Sorry, Faye.
I think you're right.
I'm always.
Was this edition of the magazine more focused on economics, though? Because you seem to you're making substantially more points and more statements about economic theory and markets.
Yeah,
than you are about algorithms and computing.
It was, yeah. They were all about HFT, but we wanted to invite Johnny to sit in to try and expand it out of that. Because obviously, well, it's good to try and really kind of open out a particular niche in which the algorithm is working, and that's what we did. Right. And that was perhaps very much a response to this Kevin Slavin talk. But I mean, for example, subversive uses of algorithms are not apparent there, but they're hopefully going to be apparent in some of the performances later tonight.
No, does it just apply in economic modelling, though? The discussion between the dysphoria and the optimism of the 2 points you started your conversation is.
Yeah.
That applies across social fields. It doesn't just apply in economics.
Yeah.
And naive as statements that you'll sound, I believe it could be motivating some of the problems in economics. And I don't believe that the problems in economics are purely their use of algorithms.
I don't think anyone's saying that.
Checking.
But in terms of the point that you're making, Ben, it's curious because, of course, the forms of commensurability that are at stake in the operation of these technological and mathematical abstractions and so on, are intrinsically seem to be totally indifferent, not just to not just to concrete labor, but to abstract. So there's a sense in which the sort of narrative that you get about how profits are generated out of high frequency trading and so on, the so to speak real world is a field of differences in valuation that can be arbitraged successfully or otherwise with these instruments and implements and so on. So to make the mediation, and I think one could, seems to be very, very difficult indeed. So to say, okay, so I guess you could, one possible argument would be to say, okay, well, you have a situation, this is a kind of vaguely catastrophist argument. So you could say, well, you have a situation in which the nature of the social reproduction of the capital-labor relation is terminally in crisis. The possibility of durably generating surplus value and capital accumulation out of traditional forms of exploitation of labor power are terminally in crisis, etc. And then this is a kind of parasitical hedging in the last days of the empire, sort of thing. Like that would be that would be the sort of value theory-ish narrative, I would imagine. So where in one sense high frequency trading would be the sort of cybernetic pendant to Planet of Slums. These are like the two, so the in the totally dystopian version, in the kind of sub William Gibson dystopian version, then the world splits into data centers in New Jersey and slums in Lagos, and that's where everything is headed. Like that would be and I think if you read some of the kind of value theory stuff about the crisis of valorization, then it does actually kind of stand to reason that would be a way of representing that kind of crisis. I mean, then you can also get, and one of the things that's curious at a much more like micro-sociological level about the Donald Mackenzie stuff, actually about pit trading and algorithmic trading, is actually, and this is actually quite interesting, it's like the resistance of workers, i.e. pit traders, against this stuff that's making them obsolescent, which is also kind of interesting. So there's a kind of like account that you could take within finance of like financial labor, which is being made obsolescent, and a lot of the resistance to it is, if you get the histories of it, a lot of the resistance to it was not like unionized, but it was like labor resistance. It was like, no, you can't have these computers in the pit, because then our bodily existence as traders and as workers is gone. So in that sense, but I think linking it to question, I find it really difficult, actually, to link it to a more systematic discussion
isn't there
about
just a massive
labor
expulsion of labour? I mean, isn't that like, of course it's not only driven algorithmically, but the algorithm seems to be the kind of like most intensified representation of that planetary expulsion of human labour out of the system.
Right, but then isn't that the curious thing, is that in one sense, I mean, that's the thing that I can't quite get my head around, and probably out of rank stupidity, but it's like, on the one hand you can say, okay, 80% of trading volume in certain markets is high frequency trading, through algorithms, etc. But at the same time, actually nobody's saying that algorithms or algorithmic trading is central to contemporary financial crisis. It just isn't.
Well, that's derivatives that is the danger.
Yeah.
Is the danger because they're enmeshed within real processes.
But it's not. HFT itself, which is like the curious thing is that though in one sense it's like the most mechanized, automated, and personal dimension, it's also not itself that which is rendering.
No, for sure. I mean,
labor obsolescence.
Well,
or
maybe
whatever,
not in finance, but there's lots. I'm just imagining the way that algorithms are also playing out in many other kinds of production.
Right.
To have that effect as well of the expulsion of labour.
There's another danger of the fetishization of the algorithm is that one seems to instantiate the purest forms of abstraction in its utter indifference to humanity, and you either get, oh, it's horrible or cool. And then you get this double fetishization because the other instance always is the military, often linked together. So the other thing that's utterly indifferent to human life is killing people directly through drones or compression of the kill chain, that stuff. So,
which is
self-automated.
So
on the one hand, you can say the algorithm is this kind of great key that will unlock all our suffering, as it's the hyper instance of abstraction. But you could just flip that around and say it's the most fetishized object that doesn't unlock anything because you pick the worst. You've got to pick the dangerous bad example to unlock everything. You see what I mean? You pick an example that's really hard to mediate. I'm just throwing that out as a possibility.
But I think we shouldn't see.
Bad example.
I think we shouldn't see kind of algorithms as being the end of possible kind of.
I'm not saying you are.
No, of course not. But there's okay, so. I mean, in the Enlightenment, algorithms weren't really that important, right? And they became important through the last kind of 20th century, or whatever. And some people seem to think that that's that we can describe everything algorithmically, and that kind of anything can be done algorithmically. But there's a limit to computation, and this is because of the fact that it employs formal logic, and there is something else than that, and mathematics has gone beyond that already. Right? But algorithms are what's practically automatable in a capitalist system. Right? But then that's not where we have to stay. We can go elsewhere than algorithms.
But at the level of the kind of fantasy of it, what I thought was really curious about reading these kind of, not just the sort of pop side, but many of the arguments about the implementation of this algorithmic revolution, turn, etc., that they're completely individualized. In terms of the narrative, is always personified in the, macho nerd maverick programmer, which is actually like if you read stuff like this Darkpool, Scott Patterson book, etc., it's all actually it's totally not impersonal. It's about this guy who listens to black metal and wants to, fuck over everybody who made his life miserable when he was in high school. And it's all written in this kind of really weird, hyper-personalized way about the recruitment of these people into these companies, and a lot of the kind of narrative and ideology around it is about screwing over corporate finance. So there's a kind of there is a really hyper-libertarian neoliberal element to it in the narrative of how it developed, which is about screwing Goldman Sachs because you're running the small guerrilla outfit of programmers and so on. And I thought that's kind of curious.
That's probably a hedge fund manager's fantasy as well in many ways.
Yeah, but the curious thing that it's not a sort of technocratic dystopia of. So that's partly, I guess that's partly its tension, because in one way, I guess it's the tension internal to that kind of Hayekian imaginary. Like on one level, you want the spontaneous order, you want the individualism. At the other level, it's mathematized. So tendentially, it would seem to be totally impersonal. It would seem to be okay, algorithms are in the world, but actually, it's about it's about conflict and agonism, and a lot of the narrative is very kind of social Darwinist. It's algorithms survive who kill other algorithms, and therefore the companies that make those algorithms. So it's the ecology, so to speak, is a total extreme, and it's constructed like that, I think. And that's the other thing. It's it's an but it's a sort of ecology that's shaped to be an ecology of conflict between different brutally competitive players, and a lot of the narrative about the algorithms themselves is about the wars between, the algo wars, the wars between the different algo. And I think that's not just a kind of like cultural studies of finance thing. I think it's actually quite central to the way that they
But this is also
imagine
something you
themselves,
get in
like.
Biffo, right? In his
Sorry,
theory.
Joseph, I think we should probably wrap up quite soon, but I just wanted to, I think there's maybe a question or two, and maybe we can make closing remarks. But.
I wanted to ask, what about subjectivity in this game of algorithms? Because that financial situation, people who are sitting by the computers watching those managers and different people, they are very dependent on that value system of that bubble of which they are making. But what about subjectivity of people who of humans, of machines who would like to be also not predictable like those algorithms of finances, and maybe in such a way invention of new singularities and becoming new singularities can create something like subversion in this like unpredictable expansion of financial sphere.
It happened like last year in August, in a sense. This kind of a singularity was probably you haven't followed it. I did because whatever, but there was this one of the big brokerage firms, one of the big market makers in America, Knight Capital Group, whatever, just went bankrupt in 45 minutes. They plugged in this new trading software, new algorithm, and it started making these very crazy trades, and they could have pulled the plug. So it was losing money very quickly, but the basic reaction, well, it can't be crazy, it must know what it's doing. Let's just wait and see, because it has, So it was this thing that they weren't confident enough to pull the plug, right? Until it lost 400 million, and the company.
The boss was away that day.
No, it wasn't.
It wasn't.
More.
Subjectivity.
No, but you have this subjectivity, this kind of crazy, in which
White river rafting,
in which it's just.
Yeah, I mean, and also, there's all these studies on kind of, hormone levels in traders and stuff like that. When when there's a bull market or a bear market, and there's differences in hormones and stuff like that. Okay, yeah, sure.
They wear these wristbands to monitor their own kind of bioactive.
Yeah, right. And then they can bet against their own
financial pheromones. But one of the curious things about that is that one of the things that comes out is actually that the point is that they're not, we have I think a very strongly ingrained tendency to think of the machinic or the mathematical or the algorithmic as predictable, deterministic, and therefore somehow inhuman. Well, so in one sense you could flip it around. It'd be fucking nice to have things that are predictable and human and not really singular, but kind of like. But actually, this stuff is totally like singular, unpredictable, and actually, meets out enormous. Enormous sort of surprising social damage.
Sure. But it's unpredictable because of the the multiplicity and diversity of it, right? Whereas a single algorithm itself, algorithms are always predictable in the sense.
But
that,
the interaction
that's what's
the ecology,
the
bad ecology.
But the base is always production of value. But the common ground is like production of value. But what if people begin to act in such a way that they become unpredictable in creating different forms of value out of capitalist system.
But I mean, for me, I have a very narrow view. I mean, for me, that just creates inefficiencies. And inefficiencies are...
you have a good...
no, but
who are you working for?
And inefficiencies produce opportunities for profit.
Ah, yes.
That's the thing. So all of...
unpredictable people can
unpredictable people actually make money for other people who have higher computational capacity.
That's a really good dysphoric note to end on.